What you are about to listen to is part 3 of 3 of the Deconstruction of the Book of Mormon episode. If you already listened to the 7.5 hours episode, you won't be getting any new information in this. However, there will be a little bumper that I tack on to the end of the episode that gives a little bit of an update on how the GoFundMe page went and how everything is developing as it stands right now. And that bumper will be tacked on at the very, very end of the episode after the outro song. So you can skip forward all the way to that if that's the only part that you want to hear. So I'll talk to you then. Without any further ado, as Joseph liked to write in the Book of Mormon, ado, here is part 3 of 3.
This is Naked Mormonism.
I pledge my life, all that I may have. I will strive to the utmost of my ability to be what you would want me to be.
It's time to find the truth.
That is, man lived before he came to this earth. He is an eternal being. Joseph Smith gave to the world the true understanding of the origin of man. That man comes to earth with a divine and eternal purpose.
Let's examine church doctrine.
And through it, all who believe and obey the glorious gospel of God, all who are true and faithful and overcome the world, all who suffer for Christ and his word,
All of it.
all shall become as their Maker and sit with him on his throne and reign with him forever in everlasting glory.
And see what it has to offer.
And having set our hand to the plow, we will never look back until this work is finished and love of God and neighbor rules the world. In the name of Jesus Christ.
What can be gleaned from Mormon teachings?
A corollary to the pernicious falsehood that God is dead is the equally pernicious doctrine that there is no devil. Satan himself is the father of both of these lies. To believe them is to surrender to him.
Where is the church heading?
I have faith that the Constitution will be saved as prophesied by Joseph Smith. But it will not be saved in Washington. It will be saved by enlightened members of this church.
The explicit tag is there for a reason, so if you get offended at what's said, it's not for you. But most importantly,
May you ponder the truths you've heard. May they help you become even better than you were.
Skepticize everything. Oh, yeah.
We do need to talk about some of the problems with authorship of the Book of Mormon dovetailing off the topic of anachronisms. I could have included this in the authorship portion of our analysis, however, it goes hand in hand with blatant anachronisms, even though these anachronisms are hidden a little bit better. What I'm referring to, of course, is the use of the Bible in the Book of Mormon. Let's start off with the easiest and most well-known out of these contradictions, and that would be the extensive quoting of Isaiah in the Book of Mormon. Well, we know that Isaiah was written in 3 different parts. Even more modern scholarship would assert that it was written in even more parts than 3, but definitively we can say that Isaiah is split up into 3 different parts. We have Proto-Isaiah, Deutero-Isaiah, and Trito-Isaiah. All of them were probably written by different people. The operative piece of this textual criticism stems from Lehi's family taking the brass plates with them to the Americas when they left in 600 BCE. The brass plates, of course, were a compilation of the Old Testament up to that point. Originally, it was thought that Isaiah was written around 650 BCE, so Lehi's family having access to Isaiah really isn't a problem. The problem arises when you talk about the different authorship of Isaiah. Now, Proto-Isaiah, the first portion, was probably completed around 650 BCE. However, the other two portions, Deutero and Trito-Isaiah, were written after the fall of Jerusalem in 587 BCE, meaning that they were written after Lehi's family left for the Americas. Well, we see significant portions of Deutero-Isaiah plagiarized into the Book of Mormon under the guise of Nephi, including them from the brass plates in 2nd Nephi, all because he just likes Isaiah so much. This is a glaring anachronism that a lot of people know about when it comes to the Book of Mormon, but there are plenty more than the Isaiah problems. Let's be clear on this. Joseph took a lot of the Book of Mormon straight from the Bible, and it introduces a lot of problems when they're examined carefully. Problems that can't just be waved away or ignored. So let's dive in and talk about them. The problems that we're talking about primarily stem from Joseph's usage of the King James Bible with the Apocrypha intact. There were plenty of these publications of the Bible around, and we think that Joseph used it for some of the Book of Mormon. First off, and the most abundant and glaring anachronism in the Book of Mormon is the use of the name Jesus Christ. And this is taken from 2 Nephi 25:19, and it's the first time that the full name Jesus Christ appears, and it creates a problem as a massive glaring anachronism. Quote, "For according to the words of the prophets, the Messiah cometh in 600 years from the time that my father left Jerusalem. And according to the words of the prophets, and also the word of the angel of God, his name shall be Jesus Christ, the Son of God." End quote. This was recorded at earliest 545 BCE. The problem is, nobody talks about Jesus in the Bible until the New Testament. The Hebrew name for Messiah is discussed abundantly, but Jesus isn't mentioned anywhere until after he lived and died, except for in the Book of Mormon, of course. Beyond that, the name Christ introduces a big problem here as well. Christ is an English derivation from the Greek word Christos, meaning Messiah or the Anointed One. The word Christ didn't exist until almost 600 years after this was recorded in Nephi. And this was supposedly recorded in Reformed Egyptian, which is a language that doesn't actually exist but reportedly predates Hebrew. If that wasn't enough to make you wonder how, maybe the frequency of Jesus might spark your interest. Jesus is mentioned directly or indirectly almost 4,000 times throughout the pages of the Book of Mormon, meaning that Jesus comes up on average once every 1.7 verses in the Book of Mormon. These weren't explicitly Jesus every time, but oftentimes they were vague references that are attributed to Jesus. I mean, the Lamb of God, the Son of the living God, Christ, Jesus Christ, the true vine, the shepherd, Redeemer of Israel, or the world, or the mighty one of Israel, Lord Jehovah, Emmanuel, Great Spirit, founder of peace, Christ the beloved Son, Alpha and Omega. All of these are present in the Book of Mormon with absolutely no regard to the real timeline in Jerusalem. These words are used before a lot of them were actually made up, and across language barriers that simply can't allow for the translation of these words into the Book of Mormon. Let's talk about that language barrier for a second. Joseph Smith emphatically claimed that the entirety of the gold plates were written in Reformed Egyptian, which is not an actual language by any scholarly study. It's a language that only existed in Joseph Smith's world. But why were they recorded in Egyptian? Well, the Book of Mormon provides a great answer to that question, and it's found in Mormon chapter 9, verse 32 and 33. Quote, "And now behold, we have written this record according to our knowledge, in the characters which are called among us the Reformed Egyptian, being handed down and altered by us, according to our manner of speech." And if our plates had been sufficiently large, we should have written in Hebrew. End quote. So basically, the complaint voiced here is that Hebrew takes up too much space, and the plates wouldn't be sufficiently large to be written in Hebrew, so they were written in Reformed Egyptian. Well, nobody that studies ancient language would agree with this statement. Egyptian is very bulky and cumbersome, using pictures to try and communicate words. Hebrew, on the other hand, is very, very efficient. The average Hebrew word is only 4 letters long, and it doesn't include vowels, making it one of the most space-conscious ancient written languages in existence. This argument simply doesn't hold up, and there is no reason why ancient Hebrews, like the family of Lehi, would have recorded their history in Egyptian, Reformed or otherwise, the people that were initially their slave masters. So now that the language barrier is up and the language in which the Book of Mormon was written can't be explained, let's talk about the King James Bible and the problems introduced there. We touched on this before, referring to Isaiah and the usage of the name Jesus Christ hundreds of years before he was even an idea, but we didn't talk about the massive truckload of other problems the King James Bible introduces into the Book of Mormon. Well, let's list some of the popular Bible verses that are found word for word in the Book of Mormon. First off, there's a lot of Isaiah that's copied and pasted right into the Book of Mormon, but there are also New Testament verses that are featured during Old Testament years of the Book of Mormon, which is a glaring anachronism. We have Malachi 4 that's written in 1 Nephi 22. Matthew 3 is written in Alma 5. Matthew 5 is in 3 Nephi 12. 1 Corinthians 12 is in Moroni 10. John 5 is in Helaman 12. 1 Corinthians 15 is in Mosiah 5. And the list goes on and on. Please keep in mind, with each of these categories of problems, we are only scratching the surface. I'm only introducing you to the ideas. There's so much more scholarship out there that can be done and that has been done on these anachronisms and problems with the Book of Mormon. The actual amount of plagiarisms from the Bible in the Book of Mormon goes way deeper than that short list of details. And it's not just 1 or 2 verses here or there. It's entire chapters or multiple chapters consecutively copied into the Book of Mormon with no regard to when they actually existed to actually be copied into the Book of Mormon. There is simply no possible way of excusing the fact that thousands of words from the New Testament are copied into the Book of Mormon word for word. If it was just Isaiah that were copied into the Book of Mormon, we would almost be able to excuse it, because the book even states that it's recorded this from Isaiah that was contained in the brass plates, and Nephi delighted in it. That's why he wanted to include it. The problem is there's so much more that's taken directly from the Bible, explicitly the New Testament, that has to be dealt with, that creates a problem on the timeline with the Book of Mormon. Another problem that lends credibility to the claim that it was indeed the King James Bible with the Apocrypha that Joseph plagiarized from is the abundance of mistranslations. If the original author of the Book of Mormon were including segments from the Old Testament taken from the brass plates, then they would be in their original Hebrew unaltered form and wouldn't be subject to any mistranslations that happened in the King James Bible. Well, when we study it, we see that those translation errors somehow made their way into the Book of Mormon, proving that they were taken specifically from the King James Bible. We have the KJV version of Isaiah using the word seraphims. Well, that's a double pluralization. It's a kick in the balls for the Book of Mormon showing a translation error. The plural of seraph is seraphim. Yet the King James Bible and the Book of Mormon in 2 Nephi 16 call them seraphims. There's no excusing that translation error in the Book of Mormon unless you concede that that part of the Book of Mormon was copied from the King James Bible. Let's talk about another translation problem that makes us think the Book of Mormon was plagiarized from the King James Bible. 2 Nephi 24:12 says, quote, "How art thou fallen from heaven, O Lucifer, son of the morning? Art thou cut down to the ground, which did weaken the nations?" End quote. Well, the problem lies with the usage of the word Lucifer. That is a Latin word, and the King James Bible only mistranslation of the original Hebrew text. That was a mistake introduced in translation centuries after the writer of Isaiah died. Some other rapid-fire problems with the Book of Mormon is a prophet named Abinadi putting on a disguise and then outing himself to the people he was disguised to blend in for. Next, the prophet Jeremiah was imprisoned by King Zedekiah 10 years into Zedekiah's reign. However, the people recording this information had fled to the Americas in the first year of Zedekiah's reign. Therefore, there is no way that these people could have known that information because they were thousands of miles away. Next, the Book of Mormon has submarines in the Book of Ether, where multiple families, along with an abundance of livestock, all spend almost a year crossing the ocean, whereas a person that was just walking could cover that much distance in a couple of months. In the first book of Nephi, chapter 4, the Book of Mormon talks about Nephi in disguise as Laban. And it talks about him meeting some brethren from the church, which is a concept that didn't even exist and wasn't discussed until the New Testament, the idea of a church or a synagogue. Next, in 2 Nephi 29:3, we read, quote, "Many of the Gentiles shall say, 'A Bible, a Bible, we have got a Bible, and there cannot be any more Bible,' end quote." Which is a passage written almost 800 years before an actual Bible existed in full form like we read it today. People didn't know what that word was or what it meant until the Old Testament and the books of the New Testament were compiled into the Bible. We could just continue talking about these contradictions for a long time, but I just don't want to bore you as a listener any more than I already have. I'll just briefly mention something interesting. With all this talk about the Bible and how Joseph probably plagiarized it from the King James Bible, there is a book of more interest that we haven't mentioned. On the Word Tree Foundation study, the 1822 print of the Holy Al-Quran of Muhammad, which was printed in America and available to Joseph soon after it was printed, is more statistically significant than the King James Bible is. Let that sit for a minute. That means that the Book of Mormon shares more similarities to the Quran than it does the Bible. Mention that to any believing Mormon and see what they think. I just figured that was worth briefly mentioning for a second. Before finishing our analysis of the Book of Mormon, we need to talk briefly about the printer manuscript and the golden plates. This is an affidavit of the man that did almost all of the work with the Book of Mormon in the E.B. Grandin printing press. His name is John H. Gilbert, and he details what the Book of Mormon was like to work with, giving us some very key information. This is his affidavit, quote, "The contract to print the Book of Mormon was to print and bind with leather 5,000 copies for $3,000. Mr. Grandin got a new font of small pica on which the body of the work was printed. When the printer was ready to commence work, Harris, meaning Martin Harris, was notified, and Hiram Smith brought the first installment of manuscript of 24 pages, closely written on common fool's cap paper. He had it under his vest, and his vest and coat closely buttoned over it. At night, Smith came and got the manuscript, and with the same precaution carried it away. The next morning, with the same watchfulness, he brought it again, and at night took it away. This was kept up for several days. The title page was first set up, and after proof was read and corrected, several copies were printed for Harris and his friends. On the second day, Harris and Smith being in the office, I called their attention to a grammatical error and asked whether I should correct it. Harris consulted with Smith, Hiram, for a short time and turned to me and said, quote, quoting Martin Harris, "The Old Testament is ungrammatical, set it as it is written." Ending Martin Harris quotes back to John Gilbert's quote. After working a few days, I said to Smith on his handing me the manuscript in the morning, "Mr. Smith, if you would leave this manuscript with me, I would take it home with me at night and read and punctuate it." His reply was, "We are commanded not to leave it." A few mornings after this, when Smith handed me the manuscript, he said to me, "If you will give your word that this manuscript shall be returned to us when you get through with it, I will leave it with you." I assured Smith that it should be returned all right when I got through with it. For 2 or 3 nights I took it home with me and read it and punctuated it with a lead pencil. This will account for the punctuation marks in pencil, which is referred to in the Mormon Report, an extract from which will be found below. Martin Harris, Hiram Smith, and Oliver Cowdery were very frequent visitors to the office during the printing of the Mormon Bible. The manuscript was supposed to be in the handwriting of Cowdery. Every chapter, if I remember correctly, was one solid paragraph without a punctuation mark from beginning to end. Names of persons and places were generally capitalized, but sentences had no end. The character or short ampersand was used almost invariably where the word "and" occurred, except at the end of a chapter. I punctuated it to make it read as I supposed the author intended, and but very little punctuation was altered in proofreading. The Bible was printed 16 pages at a time, so that one sheet of paper made 2 copies of 16 pages each, requiring 2,500 sheets of paper for each form of 16 pages. There were 37 forms of 16 pages each, 570 pages in all. End quote. To summarize what John Gilbert was saying here, the Book of Mormon was definitely no work of art when it reached the printer for publishing. It was a complete mess, and this man, John Gilbert, is responsible for the verse breaks, punctuation, capitalization, paragraphing, and basic spell checking of the entire Book of Mormon. So much can be changed in a single sentence by adding or taking away just one comma, but the entire printer's manuscript of the Book of Mormon was basically one block of text with only the breaks at chapter changes. It had no commas, no periods, no discerning capitalization for proper nouns or new sentences. John Gilbert is responsible for a lot of the differences in messages that can be derived from the Book of Mormon's different interpretations, just given his editing of the text as it was being printed. I mean, I really don't blame him. He had to punctuate it into book form somehow, and this is how he did it. Honestly, this may not be much of a problem to believing Mormons, but it poses a huge problem with the authorship of the Book of Mormon, to me anyway. All right, let's put a final nail in the Book of Mormon's coffin. We've talked a lot about the Book of Mormon today, and there's so much information to cover. This episode has been longer than any episode that I have ever produced by a very, very, very long shot, but that's because there's so much information to talk about when it comes to the Book of Mormon. We can't just graze by it and say the Book of Mormon is just crazy and there's this and this problem with it. We have to dive way, way into it to understand all of the problems with the Book of Mormon in one single point of context. We have to understand that the Book of Mormon came from the mind of Joseph Smith. We have to understand that Joseph Smith was just merely writing a book that seemed pertinent and interesting and apropos of everything that was going on around him. Joseph Smith was an interesting guy. He was very charismatic and honestly a genius, but we can only see that through the Book of Mormon being written by him as the author instead of the translator. So what is this final nail that I'm referring to in this Book of Mormon coffin? Well, it stems from one question, and it's a question that I asked when I was very, very young. Where are the golden plates today? That's a very big question, right? If the golden plates were indeed real, and we could look at them and examine them, they would be an absolute anomaly. People would be so interested in them, scholars, historians, archaeologists, because they would be something so out of place and unique in that doesn't relate to anything that was going on in New York or in the American continent in the 1830s. It would be a unique individual text. So, if it's real, then there should be some plates that it was really translated from, right? So where are they today? Most believing Mormons understand that God or the angel Moroni took them back up to heaven where they belong. Naturalistic believers think that Joseph just returned them to their resting place in the hill Cumorah in the stone box. For one thing, if the plates emerged, the church would either be accepted as completely and unequivocally true once and for all, or the church and the Book of Mormon would be proven completely false. If we could look at the plates and examine them today and study the language printed on the plates, we could know so much about the ancient American people. The ramifications of that just blow my mind. We can't possibly understand all of the holes in history that would possibly fill. I mean, it would fill a huge gap in our understanding of New World history. Volumes of books would be produced about the study of these plates. Every historian or archaeologist would clamor to get some time in with the legitimate gold plates to see what they really were and where they came from. But we simply don't have them. I mean, I remember saying as a child that if I could see the plates, then I would know that the Book of Mormon and the church is true. I think that was just my younger inner skeptic starting to develop at that point. But when I asked where the plates were, I was met with the meaningless platitude that Heavenly Father took them back up to heaven for safekeeping. That seemed to quell my questions at the time, but it didn't quell the curiosity that was driving the questions. Well, I think we may have a definitive answer to that question of where the plates are. This is something that isn't known by a lot of Mormon historians or believing Mormons especially, and I had never heard about this until I began studying for this very episode. We know where Mormon and Moroni's safe house for all of the plates are. The Book of Mormon claims that the records recorded on the 5 different sets of plates must have been an unbelievable amount of plates. Well, let's find out once and for all where all of these plates are. The information I'm about to relay to you is taken from a small pamphlet that I found online, and it was produced by the Neil A. Maxwell Institute for Religious Scholarship in conjunction with BYU. This is a church-produced pamphlet regarding the ancient repository of metal plates that Mormon and Moroni used to compile the golden plates that Joseph Smith translated into the Book of Mormon. This pamphlet is called Cumorah's Cave by Cameron J. Packer, and he might just be related to Boyd K. Packer, I'm not sure. But I'm just going to read a few excerpts from it and leave a link to it in the show notes. Just a heads up, that link is a direct download link of the pamphlet that's in PDF format, and it's unbelievably fascinating. I can't recommend reading that high enough. It's crazy. Quoting from Cumorah's Cave, quote, Wilford Woodruff recounted what he had heard Brigham Young say about the cave. President Young said in relation to Joseph Smith returning the plates of the Book of Mormon that he did not return them to the box from whence he had received them, but he went into a cave in the hill Cumorah with Oliver Cowdery and deposited those plates upon a table or a shelf. In that room were deposited a large amount of gold plates containing sacred records, and when they first visited that room, the sword of Laban was hanging upon the wall. And when they last visited it, the sword was drawn from the scabbard and laid upon a table, and a messenger who was the keeper of the room informed them that the sword would never be returned to its scabbard until the kingdom of God was established upon the earth, and until it reigned triumphant over every enemy. Joseph Smith said that the cave contained tons of choice treasures and records. End quote. What is this? The plates were taken from a huge room full of different plates? Let's read a few more of these from Comora's cave, because it just dives way deep into the crazy. Quote, although not a member of the church, Elizabeth Kane lived in St. George, Utah, and entertained the company of Brigham Young. She recorded the following discussion. Quoting Elizabeth Kane now, quote, I asked where the plates were now, and saw in a moment from the expression of the countenances around that I had blundered. But I was answered that they were in a cave, that Oliver Cowdery, though now an apostate, would not deny that he had seen them. He had been to the cave. Brigham Young's tone was so solemn that I listened bewildered, like a child to the evening witch stories of its nurse. Brigham Young said that when Oliver Cowdery and Joseph Smith were in the cave this third time, they could see its contents more distinctly than before. It was about 15 feet high, and around its sides were arranged boxes of treasure. In the center was a large stone table, empty before, but now piled with similar gold plates, some of which lay scattered on the floor beneath. Formerly, the sword of Laban hung on the walls sheathed, but it was now unsheathed and laying across the plates on the table. And one that was with them said it was never to be sheathed until the reign of righteousness upon the earth. End quote. These just get crazier. Let me continue here. Quote, Jesse Nathaniel Smith heard Brigham Young speak in Cedar City, Utah, and recorded, I heard him at an evening meeting in Cedar City describe an apartment in the hill Cumorah that some of the brethren had been permitted to enter. He said there was a great wealth in the room, in sacred implements, vestments, arms, precious metals, and precious stones, more than a 6-mule team could draw. End quote. There was so much treasure in this room that a 6-mule team couldn't pull it out of there. Oh, this is amazing. But wait, it gets even better. Our last account that we're going to read here, there's plenty more on this pamphlet. I'm just taking a few excerpts. This is from Brigham Young in the Journal of Discourses. Quote, Oliver Cowdery went with the prophet Joseph when he deposited these plates. Joseph did not translate all of the plates. There was a portion of them sealed, which you can learn from the Book of Doctrine and Covenants. When Joseph got the plates, the angel instructed him to carry them back to Hill Cumorah, which he did. Oliver says that when Joseph and Oliver went there, the hill opened, and they walked into a cave, in which there was a large and spacious room. He says he did not think at the time whether they had the light of the sun or artificial light, but that it was just as light as day. They laid the plates on a table. It was a large table that stood in the room. Under this table there was a pile of plates, as much as 2 feet high, and there were altogether in this room more plates than probably many wagon loads. They were piled up in the corners and along the walls. The first time they went there, the sword of Laban hung on the wall. But when they went again, it had been taken down and laid upon the table across the gold plates. It was unsheathed, and on it was written these words. Now quoting the words that, I can't believe I'm saying this, were printed on the sword of Laban, quote, This sword will never be sheathed again until the kingdoms of this world become the kingdom of our God and his Christ. and quoting the words that are apparently inscribed on the sword of Laban. Back to the Journal of Discourses, quote, I tell you this as coming not only from Oliver Cowdery, but others who were familiar with it and who understood it just as well as we understand coming to this meeting. Don Carlos Smith was a young man of as much veracity as any young man we had, and he was a witness to these things. Samuel Smith saw some things. Hiram Smith saw a good many things, but Joseph was the leader. End quote. I love it. It's just so fanciful and goofy, and it just panders into this idea of a magical mindset and this idea of folklore magic ruling over Joseph Smith's life and all of his brothers. And it wasn't what they thought about occasionally. It was their entire view on the world. It was an entire mindset that they chose to live in. It was an alternate reality that they existed in sometimes. It's just amazing. All right, that is enough of those quotes from Comora's Cave. Like I said, if you want to read way more quotes than what I just listed off there, you can direct download the PDF format of this pamphlet produced by the church, and there will be a link for it in the show notes. So, let's go back to what the claims are of that. If scientists today were to excavate the Hill Cumorah, not only would they find the bodies of over 2 million Native Americans with white skin, descended from the ancient Israelites, clad in non-existent armor, holding non-existent swords with non-existent steel arrows sticking out of the corpses, we would also find the greatest archaeological treasure find of all time. If we found this room with thousands or millions of metal plates as seemingly described, featuring inscriptions of religious and historical texts, the entire paradigm of Native American studies would change forever. And more than that, the Mormon Church would rise as the one true church ever in all the history of all humanity, preaching from the most accurate documentation of American history before Old World settlers made their voyages over in the 16th century. Mormonism would forever change the face of the entire world if only we could find that one little room packed with invaluable accounts of ancient history. I mean, you thought that the Dead Sea Scrolls were an amazing find. Let's find this one room couched in the Hill Cumorah and cast a shadow on the Dead Sea Scrolls for the rest of human history. It's amazing. With that, we'll bid adieu to our study of the Book of Mormon and try to sum up all of this junk into one single conclusion. We've discussed a lot of glaring problems with the Book of Mormon and Joseph Smith's reported version of how the Book of Mormon came to be, but let's talk practicality for a minute. What do I think happened? I mean, that's the point of this podcast and why I'm writing it. What do I think? After reviewing all the evidence, what seems to be the most prevailing idea of what is come out of all of this evidence? There has to be some sort of overarching theory. Now, to be clear, I've allowed some of my own bias and opinions to shine through on this analysis today, but I've tried my best to keep this entire discussion about the indisputable facts and about the Book of Mormon itself. So, allow me to speculate on the Book of Mormon for a minute. Joseph Smith was a very, very bright young man. He was a genius. He was very intelligent. He read as many books as he could get his hands on. He was obviously engaged in politics and current events, or at least interested in them, and he probably discussed these things with anybody that was willing to strike up a conversation with him about any of these topics. I mean, he would probably talk with somebody about a book that he just read or that they just read, and then he would just seek that book out until he could consume its pages for himself. Of course, the Smith family was quite short on means. We've made that abundantly apparent in this episode. They lived in a perpetual state of squalor and destitution, and Joseph's only escape was putting himself inside of a different world that he could understand and manipulate for himself. It was a survival mechanism almost. The more Joseph practiced existing inside this fake world of magic and folklore and nature bending to his will, the more Joseph enjoyed that world. So, Joseph got to a point that he did everything he could to make that dream world a reality, to try and lift him out of this world that he so loathed, reality as we call it. He began telling people about these wonderful treasures that he was going to find buried in the ground someday. Joseph started spending more and more time with people that had similar perspectives on reality that he espoused, and eventually became leader of the treasure-seeking group. Joseph was very, very cunning and convincing with his manner of speech and conduct, and eventually became the leader of this pack. Then Joseph started paying attention to the local preachers that were touring the burned-over district. He had seen many of them around and had attended many different churches in seeking out the truth, but he couldn't get past the allure that these charismatic preachers had. I mean, there was some sort of X factor that all these Bill Miller and Ellen G. White types had that were circulating this preaching circuit, that were dressed in snazzy clothing and rolling with an echelon of followers that nearly worshipped the ground on which these people tread. Joseph began wondering how hard it would be to do this for himself, to draw the love of the crowd. He began studying other religious texts and pamphlets, looking for the key, and eventually came to an understanding. He figured out that he could simply combine his dream world, where he had spent large amounts of his time, and this religious world, where people would believe anything that was said, as long as it was delivered with enough confidence. However, Joseph needed something that would set him apart from other Bible thumper religious zealots that only drew a small crowd to their gathering. Joseph needed a book of his own. He needed his own religious pamphlet. So he gathered up his favorite books: The Late War Between the United States and Great Britain, The First Book of Napoleon, The View of the Hebrews, and then he teamed up with Oliver Cowdery, and together they produced the Book of Mormon. Joseph Smith's actions lead us to where we are today, talking about this amazing and fascinating religion and book. In our analysis of the Book of Mormon today, there is so much left undiscussed. In writing this script for this episode over the past month, I had to leave a lot of discussion topics on the cutting room floor because, there's simply too much. Every segment that I kept adding just made it more confusing and just didn't help with the continuity. I had to bring it to a stopping point somewhere, but there's so much more information that we didn't discuss. In all three topics, the historical context from which the Book of Mormon was born, from the authorship theories and the different underlying themes from the authorship that ran throughout the Book of Mormon, all the way up to the content and the claims that are in the Book of Mormon, we barely scratched the surface with how much is there. But I had to cut this off at some point. Well, I guess all of this kind of brings us back to the opening paragraph of this discussion. When you're talking about something in history, it's very hard to decide where to pick up the story, because history is so intertwined with itself. We talked about some of the politics and the world events that led up to the influences that produced the Book of Mormon, but there are so many compounding factors that had to be excised for simple lack of time in this episode. I don't think that there was any lack of factual arguments that were made against the legitimacy of the Book of Mormon today, while the arguments for its legitimacy tend to be lacking in so many ways. But I will make an open petition for discussion on this topic. If there is some evidence out there that helps the Book of Mormon or bolsters the argument that the Book of Mormon is indeed true and an ancient text of the Native American peoples on the American continents, I need to know this information. I don't need to know it for the sake of wanting to tear the argument down. I just need to know it. Let me tell you why. This last weekend, I had a discussion with my dad. We tend to talk once or twice a month for a couple of hours just to, chew the fat and get an update on what each other is doing lately. And I love these conversations. During our most recent discussion, he told me about something that a fellow church member is doing for him, just out of the goodness of his heart. The story was really fascinating, and it probably didn't have much impact on my dad's side of the discussion because it was something that was so menial and inconsequential. But it had a dramatic impact on me. I left the church around the age of 16. At that time in my life, I was a growing teenager with my own developing ideas of the world and the reality that I inhabit. I felt like I didn't need anything from the church, or maybe I just felt apathetic about my faith. I continued to attend seminary and school and ended up graduating from it, but for the most part, seminary was just my napping class. I went on to college and dropped out after a year of absolutely loathing it, and then I moved out of my parents' basement as soon as I feasibly could. I didn't care much about the church for the next few years until I began to study it. I had become an apatheist or agnostic just for sheer lack of knowledge and study, but I didn't tend to challenge myself on my theological or philosophical conclusions. The more time I poured into studying Mormonism and the Book of Mormon, the more I just became completely fascinated with it. It's strange, but it took me leaving Mormonism to become interested in Mormonism. The history of the church from its foundation is an endless rabbit hole of dynamic power shifts and widely orchestrated fraud coupled with charismatic individuals that were constantly rising to try and take over the power structure that Joseph had created. People that listen to this show have probably forgotten more history than most believing Mormons know about the church today. But that's the thing, though. We can talk about the history of the church for days. We can read and write books about Mormonism from beginning to end. We can talk to well-known scholars and historians and listen to their facts and arguments. We can listen to podcasts about Mormonism and understand other people's perspective or experience with it. We can fill years of study to try and come to some sort of grips with the facts that surround the history of the Mormon Church. We can do all of this work and still have a hole to fill. When I left the church, I don't think I truly understood what I was leaving. The sense of community is absolutely unmatched in any other organization. If a ward member needs help with anything, there is an army marching behind them to satisfy that member's cry for help. Every neighbor is a friend, and every neighbor is a person you can talk to or befriend while at church. This unbridled sense of community has a plethora of benefits for humans in general, and there's a lot of evolutionary restrictions that have created this sense of community. Some of these benefits we know about and can study, but most of them are still unknown for the most part. I would give up almost anything to be reinserted into that community, forgetting all of the knowledge that I've amassed. If I could cipher myself back into the church, I would do it. If I could take this blue pill and forget that all of this happened just for a chance to have that community back in my life, I would do it. So when I say, if there's something that proves that the Book of Mormon is true, I need to know it, I really, really mean what I say. The church can be completely false and still be beneficial to people with its strong doctrines about community. But if the Book of Mormon is genuinely true, I can ignore everything that I've learned about the church and its teachings, and I can be inserted back into that sense of community. The older I get, the more I realize how much it sucks to be an island. Luckily, our society as human beings is at a point that being outside of any community it won't get me eaten by wolves, but the unpleasant emotions and feeling of insecurity are still there. The hole that was filled by the sense of community that the church offers will always be there, and there's just no escaping that fact. This hole is something that can consume a lot of people or just create anxiety or depression at some level and cause those people to lash out. Being excised from your family or the friends and community that you knew and loved isn't something that just goes over easily. The thing is, while this hole of a lack of feeling of community is very unwelcoming and seeks to be filled with the next easiest thing available, it's manageable. Personally, I'm not consumed by it. I just wish it was something that could not be there or not be a presence in my life. Being a very emotional and communal species, there are a few emotions that we can tolerate and some that we can't. Those differences in tolerable emotions vary from person to person, and that simple fact offers a wide diversity of personality types to interact with and be around. Personally, I can tolerate the lack of a strong sense of community that the church creates within its ranks, but one emotion that I cannot bear is cognitive dissonance. Cognitive dissonance is a complicated and very ugly word, but it's extremely descriptive and useful. It's that nagging in the back of your mind when you know something is one way and you come into new information that shakes the foundation of that knowledge and comes into conflict with everything you know. If I were to submit to allow myself to start attending church again, the cost of overbearing cognitive dissonance in my mind would far outweigh any small benefits that the community of Mormonism in general could offer. It would be nice to see and interact with all those smiling Mormon faces again, but I would never be able to conceal the emotional damage that this painful sense of cognitive dissonance would be constantly inflicting on my weak human psyche. So you have to ask, where does this cognitive dissonance come from? Well, it's the church itself. We've had over 6 hours of discussion about the problems in the Book of Mormon alone, but the church consistently holds to the claim that the Book of Mormon is the most correct book on the planet. This is quoting from the Book of Mormon. "Behold, I would exhort you that when ye shall read these things, if it be wisdom in God that ye should read them, that ye would remember how merciful the Lord hath been unto the children of men, from the creation of Adam, even down until the time that ye shall receive these things, and ponder it in your hearts. And when ye shall receive these things, I would exhort you that ye would ask God, the eternal Father, in the name of Christ, if these things are not true. And if ye ask with a sincere heart, with real intent, having faith in Christ, he will manifest the truth of it unto you by the power of the Holy Ghost. And God shall show unto you that which I have written is true. End quote.
For 179 years, this book has been examined and attacked, denied and deconstructed, targeted and torn apart, like perhaps no other book in modern religious history, perhaps like no other book in any religious history. And still it stands. Failed theories about its origins have been born, parroted, and died. From Ethan Smith to Solomon Spaulding to deranged paranoid to cunning genius. None of these frankly pathetic answers for this book has ever withstood examination, because there is no other answer than the one Joseph gave as its young, unlearned translator. In this I stand with my own great-grandfather, who said simply enough, no wicked man could write such a book as this, and no good man would write it, unless it were true, and he were commanded of God to do so. I testify that one cannot come to full faith in this latter-day work and thereby find the fullest measure of peace and comfort in these our times until he or she embraces the divinity of the Book of Mormon and the Lord Jesus Christ, of whom it testifies. If anyone is foolish enough or misled enough to reject 531 pages of a heretofore unknown text teeming with literary and Semitic complexity, without honestly attempting to account for the origin of those pages somehow, especially without accounting for their powerful witness of Jesus Christ and the profound spiritual impact that witness has had on what is now tens of millions of readers, if that's the case, then such persons, elect or otherwise, have been deceived. And if they leave this church, they must do so by crawling over or under or around the Book of Mormon to make their exit. In that sense, the book is what Christ himself was said to be: a stone of stumbling and a rock of offense, a barrier in the path of one who wishes not to believe in this work.
That's the problem. That's where all this cognitive dissonance comes from. The Book of Mormon and the Mormon Church in general unequivocally claim that the Book of Mormon is true, that the church is true. I can still bear my testimony from when I had it instilled into my brain that this church is true, that Joseph Smith is a real prophet of God, that I love the church, that Gordon B. Hinckley is our one true prophet of God, that I know the Book of Mormon is true. But is it really? That's the question, isn't it? Is the Book of Mormon really true? Is Mormonism really true? This level of cognitive dissonance that I experienced while I was in the church didn't affect me until I left, until I really started studying the church and understanding how wrong it really is. If there's anything that the headlines recently are teaching us, it's that the morality of the church doesn't necessarily align with the morality of human beings. What I'm referring to, for anybody that's listening to this in the backlog, is the fact that the Mormon Church recently came out with some very unpleasant and scathing ideas and stances on homosexuality and the family structure of gays. They said that any person that is raised by two homosexual parents, two mothers or two fathers, can't get into the kingdom of God unless they denounce their family. That is horrible. That is the teaching of a very cynical and controlling and overbearing and malicious leadership that is embodied by the quorum of the 12 apostles and the presidency of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. They're disconnected from reality. They're disconnected from this evolving morality that we have as human beings. They're stuck in the 1950s. They don't understand that we're advancing as humans and that they are being left behind. To connect to a larger point, people that believe that the Book of Mormon is legitimately true, that it was really abridged by the prophet Moroni and the prophet Mormon, that it was really buried in the ground for Joseph Smith to exhume from the ground 1400 years after Moroni lived. They don't understand the true beauty of the world that we're living in. What's really more beneficial for us to look at, for us to understand and study and comprehend as a human species? What's really going to get us further? Studying a book that was dreamt up from the mind of Joseph Smith, who was a convicted and well-known fraud? Or science? What's really going to help us out the most as human beings? Studying this book that is full of meaningless platitudes and anachronisms and problems with authorship, and obviously has very traceable origins and cousin books and father books that it descended from? Or will we gain more benefit as a human species from actually studying things that we can verify and talk about and understand? The conversation that I had with Rachel Brown was just something that really opened up my mind to this entire idea of how much we really don't know as a human species. We can dig into the ground and find bones and fossils that are 95 million years old that are of a crocodiliform, or the regurgitations of a crocodiliform. We can go back to 500 million years ago to see the Cambrian explosion. We can go back well beyond that and see the primordial soup that we possibly came from. There are so much more embodied in this beautiful idea of science that is just not talked about or encapsulated by these books that are passed down from so-called prophets of the so-called Almighty God of the universe. So, given everything that we've talked about in this episode, and everything that is in the Book of Mormon that we haven't talked about, that can be easily found through any Google search or any other podcast that talks about the Book of Mormon or Mormon history. So you tell me, with today's study, did we crawl underneath or over or around the Book of Mormon? Or did we just charge straight through it and use it to destroy Mormonism in general? I implore you to study and decide for yourself. Is the Book of Mormon true? And that's it for this episode. Hopefully everybody noticed the never-before-seen title name of this episode. This episode title was preceded by CC, and that means clean cut. Just like the missionaries, nice and clean cut. It doesn't mean carbon copy, like could have been the case given the content of this episode. Any episode in the future that you see that brandishes the title of CC before the name of it won't be explicit. It won't be offensive to believing Mormon ears. There won't be any nicknames or anything abrasive or vulgar or anything that will, drive away people that are listening to this just for the facts. One of the main criticisms that is leveled against this show is its entire blind spot in audience, and that's the blind spot of believing members. Let's face it. When you follow the tenets of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, any swearing or vulgarity turns you off immediately. Any ex-Mormon listeners of this show wouldn't be able to understand that very easily. In answer to this criticism, I say that I enjoy being able to relax and openly rant about things that I'm passionate about without trying to censor myself. I don't create this show just for the listening audience. I create it to help with my own catharsis for the anger I feel for being lied to by the church for so many years. I've covered this topic before, but there's so much in the church that I feel like I have been wronged by, and I got out relatively early. There are so many other people that have gone through the church, that have served their missions, were married in the temple, spent decades in the church longer than I ever did, and they all come to the knowledge that I've come to and understand that it's all wrong, that it's all a mountain of lies, a pyramid scheme built by the tithing of the paying members, and they leave with so much more anger than I could ever possibly comprehend or empathize with. Well, as far as criticisms go, I have to listen to them, because oftentimes the criticism points out a weakness in the show that needs to be addressed. Well, this is how I'm going to address that specific criticism, that the show turns people off with the cursing and vulgarity. So any episodes that start with CC in the title will be an episode that's clean cut and tries to take on one major topic or issue in the church without any information or words that will turn off believing members. Oh, and also, like I said earlier, the nicknames won't be present in these episodes. That just kind of gives it more of a scholarly feel for anybody that's listening to try and get that out of it. I will also be taking requests for these clean-cut episodes. If there's something in Mormon history that you as the listener wants to hear about, but a clean version of it for the purposes of recommending it to somebody that might still be in the church, let me know. And I'll try and release an episode that's clean cut about some of those topics. I think that a clean cut version of the Mountain Meadows Massacre could be fun, as could the Hans Mill Massacre, or just polygamy in general. But it's up to you as the listeners to decide and make those recommendations. I'll probably do a few of these every year, depending on the demand of them. I know that this has been an exceptionally long episode, but please just give me your attention for a little tiny bit longer, because there's something that we really, really, really need to discuss, and I want to close this episode out on a really high note. Let me tell you guys a little bit about my day. Not just today, that's irrelevant, but my days in general. Typically, I wake up at 4:45 in order to get to work on time, with the exception of Wednesday mornings, which I'm up at 3:45 because that's my busy day. I usually get home around 6 o'clock most days, sometimes a little bit earlier, sometimes a little bit later if the traffic is bad. From 6 o'clock until 10:30 p.m., I'm at my computer working on this podcast. I don't have much of a time for a social life, nor do I have hobbies or anything other than occasional disc golfing. For the past year, I've been putting in 90 to 100 hour weeks with very, very few breaks in order to bring this show to life. I don't tell you this so that you can have pity on my workload or my overworked lifestyle, because that's not what I'm looking for. Pity is for people that are in a horrible situation that they can't get out of. That's not what I'm in. What I do want, however, is for you to understand the point I'm at in my life. This is a turning point. Either I can continue to work my day job and continue to beat up my body, lifting batteries every day, and then come home to hours of scripting, editing, producing, or advertising on social media, or I can embrace this turning point. I can say goodbye to the day job and devote 55 hours a week that I pour into my day job to creating content about Mormonism. You might say, where can 55 hours per week go when you're talking about a podcast? Well, I don't want this bi-weekly show to be the limit of the content that I produce. To be frank, I want this podcast to be the springboard that can launch me into much more worthy and interesting endeavors in my life. Recently, I spoke with somebody that made a very strong point to me. He said something along the lines of, it's hard to recommend a podcast and get somebody to listen to it, but it's really easy to give them a book. And I couldn't agree more. I've been writing books for the past year. I've just been reading them into a microphone and producing them as a podcast. This episode alone was almost 50 pages worth of script that could very, very easily make up a chapter or two of a book with very minor adaptation. So I think this tends to afford everybody an opportunity, not just me, but you as the listeners. If you're enjoying this show and you want to bring more Naked Mormon content to the internet, books, and possibly even more mediums, it can be done very simply. All I need is 6 months. 6 months of 80-hour weeks will be plenty to convert this show into 1 or 2 very informative, non-scathing scholarly books that can be easily distributed. The only thing I'm asking for is 6 months. By the time this episode airs, there will be a GoFundMe page set up for this goal. Now, I don't want to sound like somebody that's trying to get an easy paycheck here, because that is simply not the case. However, I do want to convey my true intentions here. I want to give the knowledge that I've amassed to the world. I don't know much about very many things, but Mormonism is a topic that I simply can't get bored with, and my knowledge of it expands continually and exponentially the more that I learn about it. I don't claim to be an expert. I said that at the very beginning of this episode. I don't claim to be an expert. I don't have scholarly knowledge of this, but I do feel like I can present the knowledge that I have in a way that's entertaining for people that are consuming this knowledge. I mean, to be perfectly honest, I gotta admit, I'm a fan of the show myself. It might be vain of me to admit, but whenever there's a new episode of Naked Mormonism that shows up on my iPhone, I cannot wait to listen to it at work, even though I've heard it 4 times already in producing it. I mean, I'm just as much of a fan of the show as everybody that listens to it, or else I wouldn't put all the work into producing it. Maybe it's narcissism or vanity, or maybe it's just a point of quality check. But for whatever reason, I can't wait to listen to a new episode of this show. Given some of the feedback that I've received about the show, I'm pretty sure that there are a few people that feel the same way about it that I do. But Naked Mormonism just isn't enough. There is so much more that I could be doing to get the history of Mormonism out there. In order to properly illustrate my sincerity in this petition for 6 months worth of living experiences, I'm willing to offer the knowledge produced in the book or books to anybody that contributes to the show. If you contribute a mere $5 to the GoFundMe page, you will get a free PDF copy of the book when it's released to the public. But that's just the GoFundMe. Let's talk about practicality for a second. Last episode, I said that the Patreon page is going to change drastically. Well, I picked up some sound advice from a friend and a fellow podcaster, and I think I have some kind of idea about where the Patreon should go and how it should influence the show. For the past year, anybody that's pledged over $10 an episode would get a special Patreon translation story that just became more and more epic with higher contribution levels. While those were a lot of fun, for the most part, people that subscribe to Patreon don't do so just to get the rewards. They're just subscribing to support the show and the work that goes into it, which is a very worthy cause. There's a lot of work that I pour into the show, and it goes out as a free medium. I don't get paid directly for what I'm doing here, even though I'm putting a lot of hours into this. Well, I haven't figured out the exacts of the Patreon rewards yet. So far, if you look at the Patreon page, it just says to be announced, all of the goals and rewards. Now, I know that the goals need to be changed. So, the new Patreon goals will be at the increments of $500, $1,000, or $2,000 per episode. Right now, the show is a mere $73 away from the first goal of $500 an episode. That first goal will just involve the books. Once the Patreon pledges reach the $500 goal, every Patreon will get an email link with a PDF of the book, whether they're $1, $5, $10, or $100 contribution per episode. Once the show hits $1,000 per episode, then we're starting to talk about some real sustainable income that I can actually live off of. Once it hits $1,000, I will start producing a second podcast that just deals with current events, preferably on Mormonism. That will leave this show to be devoted to nothing but the history of the church. And hopefully that will soak up a bit of a blind spot that this show has. So far, I've occasionally addressed some current event topics that are happening in the Mormon church, but there's a lot of other podcasts out there that are covering, things that are going on in the church. But I feel like I can offer my own individual take on those things, and I would like to do that. But this type of show doesn't really seem like the proper avenue to do that. It seems like that would be much better embodied in a separate podcast completely. So that's going to be the goal at $1,000 an episode. An entire other show will be created and just focusing on Mormonism and current events, because there's a lot going on in the church right now. Once the show hits $2,000 an episode, I'm going to go on tour. That's right, I'm going to go visit various ex-Mormon meetups, and I'm going to produce live episodes, all while still getting out 2 episodes of the show every month and producing the other podcast that is going to start being produced at $1,000 episode. Now, this has kind of been confusing, and you may ask why I'm doing all of this. Well, I'll just refer you back to the turning point. I'm at a turning point in my life. I can continue to waste my talents at a dead-end sales job that I'm at currently, or I can pour those hours and that talent into producing better and more content for you, the listener. Honestly, I don't ask for money very often, and right now it just kind of feels like a good time to do so. I've produced hours and hours of Mormon history, and I feel like that's something that I want to get better at. But when it comes to asking for money, I feel so weird doing it. I feel wrong almost. I feel like a beggar on the street holding out my hat saying, "Oh, please, can you spare some change?" But that's not what this is about. It's about expanding. It's about creating more. It's about getting to a point where this is something of a livable investment. It's not something that's just taking up all of my free time. It's something that I can make a life out of doing. So, just because I'm asking for money, I would only ask you, doesn't that really stigmatize this show as like a money-making scheme? I mean, I don't want it to seem that way. If I wanted to actually make money off the podcast, well, first of all, I wouldn't produce a podcast because that's not the way to make money. But I would put the episodes behind a paywall or something and sell the upcoming book or books at $20 a pop at Barnes & Noble or something. I mean, I would spend every episode pleading for more and more money and more donations, but that's simply not what I'm doing here. I've put a year worth of work in, and now I'm asking to be given some of my life back so that I can reinvest those hours that are given back to me into making this a sustainable project that I can live off of. The time is absolutely ripe for this podcast to grow and expand, for books to be written on Mormonism, and for this work to be done and given to the internet-driven world for the greater good. So, as the creator of and a fellow fan of this podcast, will you help this information get out there to be made available for many, many others? Is that something that we can do as a team? Please don't think that the books are the climax of what I want to create, or the tour of live episodes. That's not the climax. What I'm really trying to get to as an end game, think about this. How great of a story is Joseph Smith for adaptation to a TV series? Don't you think that could make for a pretty interesting TV show? Or Netflix episode? That's what I want to work on. That's where I want to go with this. I didn't start this podcast just to get to the point of having a successful podcast or just to start writing books. The narrative that's created in this podcast could be so easily adapted to a TV series, and people could love it. Joseph could be the new Frank Underwood, the new Walter White, because he is the anti-hero. He is the person that is doing these underhanded deals and is lying to people left and right and is constantly stabbing his friends in the back just for his own personal gain. Well, is that something that we want to see adapted to TV? I guess that's something that will just be played out in the next few weeks here. Let's see if this is a sustainable project. I really, really hope so. And honestly, I'm not trying to be too heavy-handed in this petition for money or for sustainability. To start this off, to kick it off, all I'm asking for is 6 months worth of donations. 6 months worth of living expenses. That's all I need. And while the GoFundMe page might be fantastic for people that want to one-time donate to see the show go on, Patreon is going to be much, much more preferable because it's more sustainable. A person can't live off of a lump sum given to them by GoFundMe. However, plenty of other people have demonstrated that Patreon can create an economy of sustainable living. And that's what I'm hoping for, and that's why anybody that contributes to Patreon, once it hits the $500 goal, will receive a link with the PDF of the book or books once they're produced. Because I'm not creating the information to make money. I'm creating the information to be put out there. All I'm asking is that we, as listeners of this show, can rally together and create this sustainable web for me to fall into so I can actually create this podcast and really get it off the ground and turn it into something that is really a presence in the internet-driven society that we live in. That's all I have. That's all I'm asking for. I don't want to sound like I'm pleading for money, but I do want this to sound like I'm almost a street performer. Like I've performed, I've done the work, and there's been this body of spectators that have watched the performance, and now I'm putting my hat out on the ground and saying, well, your emails and your iTunes reviews are appreciated, and people that send in emails and say they appreciate the show and enjoy it and they're getting a lot out of it, that is appreciated. That constitutes the milk that's derived from the show. But what good is milk without any meat? Without the ability to consume anything with real substance, milk doesn't make up for the meat that is necessary for sustaining life. So, thank you. Thank you to everybody that does contribute to the show. Thank you to anybody that does send in appreciation or writes a review on iTunes or Stitcher or wherever you're downloading the podcast from, because that helps out so much. Everything that you guys do as listeners, I can't express my gratitude for. I truly appreciate and love you for what you do. Thank you so much. I can't express that enough. But this episode has gone on way too long. I've rambled on enough about what the plans are for the show and where it's going. I just hope that what I've said today has spurred people to some action, and that it will be some sort of resource for people that are interested in the Book of Mormon or interested in Mormonism in general. That this will be a place where people can go to find this information in palpable form, in listenable form, while they're gardening or while they're driving or working or exercising. They can listen to this and expand their knowledge and understand Mormonism and the Book of Mormon. That's what this show is for. Before finishing up today, we need to thank a few people. Thanks again, David Michael and Rachel Nana Brown, for fantastic interviews. Thanks to all the podcasters for lending me their voices for the new intro. If you'd like to have your voice featured in the intro, or your blog or podcast or group plugged at the end of the episode, you can find the script on the website. Simply email an MP3 of you saying those clips and it will be introduced on the show. Just like on today's episode, thank you to James of the Trader's Edge podcast, Matthew the Apostle of In the Name the God podcast, Paul from Coranify Me and Atheist Apocalypse, Heretic Woman from Atheist on Air Beyond the Trailer Park and Atheist Apocalypse, David Michael from the My Book of Mormon podcast, and of course Noah and Lucinda Lugens of the Scathing Atheist, Skeptocrat, and God Awful Movies. These are all great podcasts and you should really check them out. There will be links to their shows in the show notes. Thank you to all the patrons who support the show. If you'd like to be as awesome as them, you can go to patreon.com/nakedmormonism to sign up to make your per episode donation. If you can't afford a couple bucks, you can always help out the show a bunch by going on to iTunes, Stitcher, or your podcast app of choice to leave a 5-star review for the show, and it'll only cost a couple of minutes instead of a couple of bucks. Thank you to everybody that shares the show through Facebook, Twitter, and other social medias. If you want to get in touch with me directly, email nakedmormonism@gmail.com, and I'll try to answer your questions during the next listener mail segment. Check out the show notes and a lot more information about the show on nakedmormonismpodcast.com. Thanks to Demonista for working so hard on the Facebook page that stays rich with fresh content and lots of exciting conversation. Thanks to Jason Camo for his talented musical creation that is used in this show with permission. For more of his amazing musical stylings, you can go to aloststateofmind.com. I'm Bryce Blankenagel and would like to thank you, especially the listener, for lending me your ear. I hope to talk at you next time here on the Naked Mormonism Podcast. thanks for listening in all the way to the end, or just for fast forwarding just to find this bumper here. I did want to just give a quick update on how the GoFundMe page went and is going currently, and how things are developing, like I said at the intro bumper. As it stands, the GoFundMe page is fully funded, and even though it is funded, it's going to stay up for the entire time that I'm working on these books for any other extra donations that people want to trickle in throughout the new year. And I have a lot of people to thank for that. I've been thanking people all along, but when I get closer to a final tally, I'll do a proper thank you to everybody, and then announce that in one of the later on shows. As far as the goal goes, I've adjusted my thoughts on how I'm going to write the books. I know at the end of this episode I said that the first book will be on Joseph Smith, the second will be about the Book of Mormon. Well, I don't really want to do that. I want to do the first book about the Book of Mormon, and then the second book is just going to be the, hopefully, first book in a lineup of kind of like a historical fiction, only heavily fact-based type of novel style book, and it will be telling the story of Joseph Smith. Basically, it'll be kind of a almost a work in the glory type thing, only for people that are not believers in the church and don't really want to read stuff by Gerald Lund. So that's what everything is looking up to right now. As far as the current book goes right now, at the time of recording this, it's going fairly well. It just blows my mind how much work is going into actually writing a book. It's surprising, to say the least. However, I am finding that there are a lot of things that I need to extrapolate on right now. As of the day this episode comes out, I'm already over 100 pages, and it just keeps getting bigger and bigger because I'll find a single paragraph that I want to explain a little bit better, and then it blows up to 2 or 3 pages by itself. So the book is going to take a while to get chomping through and get a rough draft out there. But, as it stands, the book just keeps getting bigger and better and longer and more heavily cited. And there's still a lot of work to do. And I'm hoping to have this book in its rough draft form by the beginning of February, hopefully. We'll see how that goes. So that's the update for now. Next week, from the day this episode is released, next week will be a brand new episode about the historical timeline. It'll be a regular style episode, no special edition, no Exmo Hangout. I know you guys have been waiting a while for that one, but it's kind of just the schedule has fallen that it would be this way, and I'm finding it a lot easier to produce an episode or produce the script for an episode because I have a little bit more time to do it now, and I'm really, really looking forward to jumping back into the historical narrative. It's fascinating as hell. And I'm also hoping that the direction the show is going to be pleasing. I've had a couple of people give me some very constructive feedback lately, and I'm taking it all into stride and hopefully making the very best out of this that I possibly can. So, hang in there with me. Thank you all so very much for listening. And if this was your second time listening through the entire 7.5 hours, I say congratulations, and well, just wait for it to come out in a book form. It's going to be a lot better. A lot better than this episode was. So, yeah, just keep an eye out for that. I hope everybody's as excited about the book as I am right now, because I'm just bouncing in my seat. I'm enjoying every day that I get to wake up in the morning and not have to, be on my way to work at 4:30. I can actually come here and, just walk out of my bedroom and sit down at my desk and start working, and it's work that I'm enjoying, and I'm able to live a lot more. So, thank you to everybody that did support the GoFundMe page, because now I have the availability to write, to actually produce content full time, and the adjustment is, it's something that I needed. I really, really needed this adjustment, and I couldn't be happier with how everything is going. So I know I say thank you frequently, but this is, from the bottom of my heart, deep, sincere gratitude to all of the people that have made it possible for me to embark on this journey and this career change. Going from a truck driver to a book writer is, it's a very nice transition. So thank you all so very much, and I look forward to meeting and exceeding your expectations in the future.